Edward Grant's attic, on most days, resembled a museum more than a home. Immaculate, cold, untouched by life, his 9-year-old son Noah hadn't moved or spoken in years. Doctors had given up, hope had faded. But everything changed one quiet morning when Edward returned home early and witnessed something impossible. His cleaner, Rosa, was dancing with Noah, and for the first time, his son was looking at her. What began as a simple gesture ignited a spark, unraveling years of silence, pain, and buried truths. This story is a testament to quiet miracles, profound loss, and the power of human connection, because sometimes healing comes not from medicine, but from movement. The morning at Granpin House unfolded with mechanical precision, like any other. Staff arrived at appointed times. Their greetings were brief and essential, their movements measured and quiet. Edward Grant, founder and CEO of Grant Technologies, left for a board meeting shortly after 7 a.m. He only paused to check the untouched tray at Noah's room door. The child hadn't eaten again. He never ate. 9-year-old Noah Grant hadn't spoken in nearly 3 years. A spinal injury sustained in an accident that claimed his mother's life had left him paralyzed from the waist down. But what truly frightened Edward wasn't the silence or the wheelchair, but the emptiness in his son's eyes. No pain, no anger, just a void. Edward had poured millions into therapy, experimental neuroprograms, and virtual simulations. None of it mattered. Noah sat every day in the same spot by the same window, under the same light, motionless, unblinking, untouched by the world. The therapist said he was closed off. Edward preferred to think Noah was locked in a room he refused to leave. With an unexpected 2 hours free, he decided to return home, not out of nostalgia or worry, but out of habit. There was always something to check, something to fix. The elevator ride was quick, and as the penthouse doors on the top floor opened, Edward stepped out with his usual mental checklist running behind his eyes. He wasn't prepared for the music. It was faint, almost elusive, and not from the penthouse's built-in system. The music had a genuine, imperfect, live texture. He froze, uncertain, then slowly walked down the hallway. Each step was deliberate, almost involuntary. The music grew clearer, a gentle yet persistent waltz. Then came something even more unimaginable, the sound of movement. It wasn't the robotic hum of a vacuum or the clatter of cleaning supplies, but something fluid, like a dance. And then he saw Rosa. She spun slowly and gracefully, barefoot on the marble floor. Sunlight streamed through the open blinds, casting soft stripes across the living room, as if trying to dance with her. In her right hand, held delicately as if it were porcelain, was Noah's hand. His small fingers were loosely intertwined with hers, and she gently pivoted, guiding his arm through a simple arcing swing, as if he were leading her. Rosa's movements weren't grand or rehearsed, they were calm, intuitive, personal. But it wasn't Rosa who stopped Edward, nor even the dance. It was Noah, his son, his broken and unreachable child. Noah's head was tilted slightly upward. His pale blue eyes, fixed on Rosa's figure, followed her every move, unblinking, unwavering, intensely present. Edward's breath hitched, his vision blurred, but he couldn't look away. Noah hadn't made eye contact with anyone in over a year, not even during the most intensive therapies. Yet, he wasn't just present, but participating, however subtly, in a waltz with a stranger. Edward remained there longer than he realized, until the music faded, and Rosa gently turned to look at him. She didn't appear surprised by his presence. Her expression was serene, as if she had expected this moment. She didn't release Noah's hand immediately. Instead, she slowly stepped back, allowing Noah's hand to drop by his side, as if waking him from a dream. Noah didn't flinch or recoil. His gaze dropped to the floor, but not with the emptiness and detachment Edward was accustomed to. He looked natural, like a child who had simply played too hard. Rosa gave Edward a simple nod of her head, not an apology, nor an admission of guilt, just a gesture, like an adult acknowledging another across an invisible line that hadn't yet been crossed. Edward tried to speak, but nothing came out. His mouth opened, his throat constricted, but words betrayed him. Rosa turned and began gathering her cloths, humming softly, as if the dance had never happened. It took Edward several minutes to move. He remained standing, like a man shaken by an earthquake he hadn't anticipated. His mind raced with a torrent of thoughts. Was this a breakthrough? A breach of boundaries? Rosa had no therapy experience. Who had given her permission to touch his son? Yet, none of these questions held any real weight compared to what he had witnessed in that moment. The reality of Noah's reaction, his responsiveness, was true, undeniable, more real than any report, MRI, or prognosis he had ever read. He slowly approached Noah's wheelchair, almost expecting the child to revert to his usual state. But Noah didn't retreat. He also didn't move, but he didn't fade either. His fingers curled slightly inward. Edward noticed the slightest tension in his hand, as if a muscle had remembered its existence. And then, the softest whisper of music returned. Not from Rosa's device, but emanating from Noah himself. A barely audible hum, faint but melodic. Edward stepped back, staggered. His son was humming. He didn't utter a word for the rest of the day. Not to Rosa, not to Noah, not to the silent staff who sensed something had shifted. He locked himself in his study for hours, reviewing surveillance footage, trying to convince himself it wasn't a hallucination. The image stayed with him forever. Rosa spinning, Noah watching. He felt no anger, no joy. What he felt was unfamiliar, a rupture in the silence that had become his reality. Something in the space between loss and longing. Perhaps a flicker. Hope. No, not yet. Hope was dangerous, but undoubtedly, something had broken. The silence wasn't broken by noise, but by movement, by something alive. That night, Edward didn't have his usual drink, didn't answer emails. He sat alone in the dark, listening not to music, but to its absence, replaying in his mind what he never thought he'd see again, his son in motion. The next morning demanded questions, consequences, explanations, but none of it mattered in the moment it all began. A homecoming that shouldn't have happened, a song that wasn't meant to be played, a dance unsuitable for paralyzed children. Nevertheless, it happened. Edward entered his living room, expecting silence, but instead heard a waltz. Rosa, the cleaner he had barely noticed until this moment, held Noah's hand as she spun, and Noah, unblinking, silent, unreachable, wasn't staring out the window nor into emptiness. He was looking at her. Edward didn't call Rosa immediately. He waited until the staff had dispersed and the house returned to its usual order. But when he invited her to his study that evening, the look he gave her wasn't angry, not yet, but something colder, controlling. Rosa entered without hesitation, her chin slightly raised, not defiant, but ready. She had expected this. Edward sat at his elegant walnut desk, hands clasped. He gestured for her to sit. She declined. "Explain what you were doing," he said quietly, brokenly. "Not one extra syllable." Rosa clasped her hands in front of her and met his gaze. "I was dancing," she simply said. Edward's jaw tightened. "With my son?" Rosa nodded. "Yes." The silence that followed was sharp. "Why?" he finally asked, almost spitting the word. Rosa didn't flinch. "Because I saw a spark in him. I touched a song, his fingers tensed. He followed the rhythm and I moved with him." Edward stood. "You are not a therapist, Rosa. You are not trained. Do not touch my son." Her reply was immediate, firm, but never disrespectful. "No one else touches him. Not with joy, not with trust. I didn't force him. I followed him." Edward paced. There was something in her calmness that made him more nervous than a challenge. "You could have destroyed months of therapy. Years," he mumbled. "There's a protocol, a structure." Rosa remained silent, then turned to him. "Do you know how much I pay for his care? What do his specialists say?" Rosa spoke again, slower now. "Yes, and yet they don't see what I saw today." He chose to follow with his eyes, his spirit. Not because he was told to, but because he wanted to. Edward felt his defenses crumble, not in agreement but in confusion. None of this conformed to the formulas he knew. Do you think a smile is enough? That music and movement will solve trauma? Rosa didn't answer. She knew better than to argue about this, understanding that attempting to do so would diminish the truth. Instead, she said, I danced because I wanted to make him smile, because no one else did. It was more powerful than I expected. Edward's fists clenched, his throat dry. You crossed a line, he nodded once. Maybe, but I'll do it again. He was alive, Mr. Grant, if only for a minute. The words hung between them, raw, undeniable. He was close to firing her, but then he felt an impulse in his bones, a need to restore order, control, the illusion that the systems he had built protected his loved ones. But something in Rosa's last phrase lingered with him. He was alive. Edward said nothing more, returning to his seat, dismissing her with a faint wave of his hand. Rosa gave a final nod and left, alone again. Edward looked out the window. His reflection stared back from the glass. He didn't feel victorious, rather he felt disarmed. He had expected to crush any foreign influence Rosa might have awakened. Instead, he found himself staring into the empty space where certainty once lived. Her words hadn't resonated with rebellion or sentiment, but with truth. And the craziest part was, she hadn't asked for permission to stay. She hadn't defended her case. She had simply told him what she saw in Noah, what he hadn't seen in years. It was as if she spoke directly to a wound that still bled beneath layers of efficiency and logic. That night, Edward poured himself a glass of whiskey but didn't drink it. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. The music Rosa played wasn't even recognizable as a song, but the rhythm stayed with him, a soft and familiar pattern, like a breath, if breath could be choreographed. He tried to recall the last time he'd heard music in this house that wasn't linked to a therapist's recommendation or an attempt at stimulation. And then he remembered her, Lillian, his wife. She loved to dance, not professionally, but freely, barefoot in the kitchen, holding Noah when he was just learning to walk, humming tunes known only to her. Edward had once danced with her in the living room. Just after Noah's first steps, he had felt both ridiculous and light. That was before the accident, before the wheelchair and the silence. He hadn't danced since. He hadn't allowed himself to. But that night, in the quiet of his room, he found himself swaying slightly in his chair, not quite dancing, not quite still. Unable to resist the pull of that memory, Edward stood and walked to Noah's room. He opened the door carefully, almost fearing what he might see or not see. Noah sat in his wheelchair with his back to the door, looking out the window as usual, but there was something different in the air. A faint sound. Edward moved closer. It wasn't a device or a speaker. The sound was coming from Noah. His lips were slightly parted. The sound was intermittent, almost silent, but undeniable. Humming. The same melody Rosa had played, broken, trembling, imperfect. Edward's chest tightened. He remained standing, afraid to move, afraid that any fragile miracle unfolding would cease if he drew nearer. Noah didn't turn to look at him. He just continued to hum, swaying slightly. The movement was so subtle Edward might have missed it if he hadn't been searching for signs of life. And then he understood. Noah had always been alive. He had just stopped waiting for them. Back in his own room, Edward didn't sleep. Not from insomnia or stress, but from something stranger. The weight of possibility. Something about Rosa disturbed him. Not because she had overstepped, but because she had made the impossible happen. Something the most renowned, expensive, and recommended specialists couldn't achieve. She reached Noah not through technique, but through something far more dangerous: emotion, vulnerability. She dared to treat his son as a child, not a diagnosis. Edward had spent years trying to rebuild what the accident had destroyed, with money, with systems, with technology. But what Rosa did couldn't be replicated in a lab or measured on graphs. It scared him. And yet, though he still refused to admit it, it gave him something more. Something he had buried under pain and protocol. Hope. And that hope, however small, rewrote everything. Rosa was allowed to return to the attic under strict conditions, cleaning only. Edward had made it clear from her arrival. No music, no dancing, just cleaning. He spoke without meeting her eyes. His voice was deliberately neutral. Rosa didn't argue. She nodded once, picked up her mop and broom, as if accepting the rules of a silent duel, and moved with the same conscious grace she always displayed. There were no sermons, no constant tension, just a faint, unspoken understanding between them that something sacred had happened, and now it would be treated as something fragile. Edward told himself this was caution, that any repetition of what had occurred might disrupt the very flicker that had ignited within Noah. But deep down, he knew he was protecting something else entirely. Furthermore, he wasn't ready to admit that her presence had permeated a corner of his world untouched by science or system. Now, he watched her from the hallway through the crack of the open door. Rosa didn't talk to Noah. She didn't even look at him directly. She hummed, performing soft melodies in a language Edward couldn't recognize. These weren't nursery rhymes or classical pieces. They were ancient, rooted tunes, passed down by memory, not by notes. At first, Noah remained as still as ever. His chair was by the same window, and his face held none of the emotion Edward so desperately wanted to see. But Rosa didn't expect miracles. She cleaned with a gentle rhythm, not posed, but deliberate. Her movements were fluid, as if she was in a flow, not playing a role, but simply existing. Occasionally, she paused midway and subtly shifted her hum, allowing the melody to dip or vibrate. Edward couldn't explain it, but it affected the atmosphere between them, even from the hallway. And then, one evening, something small happened that anyone else might have missed. Rosa quickly walked past Noah, and her melody contracted into a brief minor note. His eyes followed her for just a second, but Edward saw it. Rosa didn't react. She didn't speak or boast about it. She continued humming without interruption, as if she hadn't noticed. The next day, the same thing happened. This time, as she passed, his eyes moved to her and lingered there for a second longer. A few days later, he blinked twice when she turned. Not quick blinks, but deliberate ones. It was almost like a silent conversation, as if he was learning to respond in the only way he could. Edward continued to observe day after day. He stayed out of sight, behind the wall, arms crossed, motionless. He told himself this was research, observation, what he needed to know to understand if these responses were real or just coincidence. But over time, he realized something was changing, not just in Noah, but in himself. He no longer expected Rosa to fail. He hoped she wouldn't stop. She never imposed, never cajoled, never flattered. She simply offered presence, a constant rhythm Noah could turn to when he wished. Rosa had no plans, no folders, no schedules, just the same calm certainty.
Sometimes she left a colored cloth on the table, and Noah would look at it. Once, while sweeping, she paused to tap a wooden spoon lightly against a bucket. The rhythm was soft, almost a whisper, but Edward noticed Noah's foot move just once, barely perceptible, then remain still. These weren't grand breakthroughs, not by traditional standards, but they were something more. Proof that connection wasn't a switch to be flipped, but ground to be nurtured. Edward began spending more and more time behind the hallway wall. His breath would slow to match Rosa's rhythm. Once, he tried to explain it to Noah's physical therapist, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain what he felt seeing a cleaner become a conduit? How could he describe eye flickers and finger flexes as milestones? It would be called anecdotal, irregular, unconfirmed. Edward didn't care.
He had learned not to underestimate what seemed like nothing. Rosa treated these moments like seeds, not with haste, but with the certainty that something invisible was working beneath the surface. There were no ceremonies or announcements. Rosa left at the end of her shift, tools in hand. She nodded to Edward if their paths crossed, and disappeared into the elevator, as if nothing had changed that day. It was insane, in a way, how humbly she wielded power. Edward couldn't tell if he was grateful or terrified by how much he needed her. He wondered where she learned these lullabies, who sang them to her, but he never asked. It felt wrong to reduce her role to something explainable. The main thing was that when she was in the room, Noah was there too, if only a little more than the day before. On the sixth day, Rosa finished sweeping and cleaning without extra noise. Noah followed her movements 3 times that morning. Once, Edward swore he saw the child smile. Just a twitch on his cheek, but it was there. Rosa noticed it too, but made no comment. This was her gift. She allowed moments to live and die, without dressing them up. Gathering her belongings to leave, she walked to the table and paused. From her pocket, she took out a neatly folded napkin. Without a word, she placed it on the table beside Edward's usual reading chair and looked into the hallway once. She knew he was watching her, and left. Edward waited for her to leave before approaching. The napkin was white, the kind usually kept in abundance, but on it was a childlike yet accurate pencil drawing. 2 stick figures, one tall, one small. Their arms were outstretched, slightly bent, undoubtedly in the middle of a spin. One figure had hair drawn with thick lines, the other, a simple circle for a head. Edward's throat constricted. He sat down and held the napkin for a long time. He didn't need to ask who drew it. The lines were wavering and uneven. There were smudges where the pencil had been erased and redrawn. But it was Noah, his son, who hadn't drawn anything in 3 years, who hadn't initiated communication, much less recorded memories. Edward stared at the drawing. Its simplicity was more poignant than any photograph. Now he could see it clearly. In the moment Rosa made him spin, Noah's hand was in hers. This was what Noah chose to remember. This was what he chose to keep. It wasn't a plea, not a cry for help. It was an offering, a crumb of joy left by a child who had once retreated into silence. Edward didn't frame the drawing. He didn't call anyone. Simply placed the drawing neatly on the table and sat silently beside it, allowing the image to speak what his son could not. That night, as the sun began to set and shadows lengthened on the attic floor, the napkin remained where Rosa had left it. It was proof that something within Noah was slowly learning to move again. The therapy session began as usual, with clear structure, silence, and polite distancing. Noah sat in his wheelchair before the speech therapist, who had visited the attic twice a week for over a year. She was competent, kind, but ultimately ineffective. She spoke in a soft and encouraging tone, used visual aids, repeated affirmations, and waited patiently for responses that rarely came. Edward stood on the other side of the glass partition, arms crossed, observing without much hope. He had seen this too many times to expect anything new. The nurse, a kind woman named Carla, who had been with them since the accident, sat nearby, taking notes and occasionally looking at the child as if wishing he would respond with his presence. Suddenly, the elevator chimed, and Rosa entered, unnoticed by anyone. At first, she quietly walked in, holding a folded scarf in her hands, soft, bright, well used, so it seemed to hold a special significance. She didn't speak immediately. She simply stood in the room's doorway, waiting for the therapist to make a note. There was a moment of hesitation, but no objection. Rosa nodded to Carla and took a step forward. Edward leaned closer to the glass as Rosa approached Noah. She didn't kneel or touch him. She simply lifted the scarf, letting it hang and sway slightly, like a pendulum. Her voice was soft, just loud enough to be heard. "Want to try again?" she asked, tilting her head. It wasn't coaxing, not an order, but an open and gentle invitation. The room held its breath. The therapist turned slightly, unsure whether to intervene. Carla froze. Her eyes darted between Rosa and Edward, not understanding how this fit into her role. But Noah blinked once, then a second time. 2 slow and deliberate blinks. His version of yes. The therapist sighed softly. Edward's hand dropped from his mouth. The sound he made was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He stepped away from the window, suddenly unable to bear being seen with a constricted throat. It wasn't just a reaction, it was an acknowledgement. Noah understood the question he had answered. Rosa didn't applaud or react. she simply smiled. Not at Noah, but with him, and began slowly wrapping the scarf around her fingers. She played with the scarf gently, not gripping, then unwound it, letting the ends unfurl in the air. Each time the scarf touched Noah's fingertips, she paused to see if he would respond. After a few movements, his hand shifted, not reflexively, but by choice. He didn't grasp the scarf, but he acknowledged it. Rosa never rushed. She allowed him to set the pace. The therapist now, wordlessly, slowly stepped back to observe. It was clear the session had shifted into other hands. Rosa wasn't performing a therapeutic routine. She was following a language that only she and the child seemed to understand. Every moment was won not by expertise, but by intuition and trust. Edward remained behind the glass. His body was tense, but his face had changed, becoming vulnerable. For years, he had paid people to unlock his son and help him overcome the barrier of immobility. And here was Rosa, without titles, without degrees, with a scarf in her hands. And she had elicited a yes from a boy everyone else had given up trying to reach. It wasn't dramatic, but it was revolutionary, a quiet revolution, unfolding moment by moment. When the session ended, Rosa put the scarf back in her bag, making no sound. She didn't meet Edward's eyes as she left. He didn't follow her. He couldn't. His emotions hadn't yet reached the right moment. For a man who made decisions for empires, he felt powerless in the face of what he had just witnessed. Returning to her cleaning duties, Rosa continued with her usual routine, wiping surfaces, straightening frames, gathering linens. It seemed the miracle that had just occurred was as natural as breathing to her, and perhaps, for her, it was. That night, after the staff had gone and the attic lights were out, Rosa returned to her cart. Tucked between a spray bottle and a folded cloth, she found a simple, typewritten note without an envelope. Just a small, neatly folded square. Carefully, she unfolded it. 4 words. Thank you, P. Rosa read the note twice, then again. There was no signature beyond the initials, no instructions or warnings, just gratitude, fragile and sincere. She folded the note and put it in her pocket, without a word. But not everyone was pleased. The next day, as Rosa was gathering supplies in the laundry room, Carla approached her with a kind but firm gaze. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said, quietly folding a towel. Rosa didn't reply immediately. Carla continued, "He's starting to wake up, and that's beautiful, but this family has suffered in silence for years. You're uncovering too much. You'll be blamed for the pain that comes with healing." Rosa turned, calmly, still serene. "I know what I'm doing," she said. "I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just giving him space to feel." Carla hesitated. "Be careful," she said. "You're healing what didn't break." There was no malice in her voice, only concern and empathy. She wasn't saying this to discourage, but because she had seen the Grant family crumble in pieces. Rosa gently placed her hand on Carla's. "Human, that's why I'm here," she whispered. There was no doubt in her eyes. Later that night, Rosa was alone in the cleaning room, holding the scarf. It was the same scarf she had brought from her mother's home. It smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. She didn't need it for work, but she kept it nearby. Now, not for show, not for pride, but as a reminder that softness could still break through. Sometimes, what the world called incompetence was precisely what a broken soul needed. She had seen the blink, seen the spark, and though Edward had said no more than those 4 words, she felt his walls had shifted enough to let in light. The next morning, he returned to the attic early, humming again, a little louder. This time, no one stopped him. The glass door behind which Edward stood was no longer closed. It happened so fast, yet it felt like a moment frozen in time. Rosa knelt beside Noah's wheelchair, adjusting a ribbon they used for a coordination exercise. Edward watched from the doorway, arms crossed as always, not from coldness, but in a habitual attempt to control any emotions that might flare beneath the surface. The session went gently. Rosa allowed Noah to set the pace. As always, Noah's hand movements improved, a little smoother, a little more confident. She never rushed him, never asked him to do more than he could. And then, as she was gathering the ribbon into her hand, Noah opened his mouth. Air moved. It wasn't an opening that signaled a yawn or a cough. His lips parted with intention. From them came a hoarse, cracked, barely formed word. Rosa. At first, Rosa thought she imagined it, but looking up, she saw his lips move again. Softer now, barely audible. Rosa. 2 syllables. The first name he had spoken in 3 years. Not a sound, not a whisper, but her name. Rosa held her breath. Her body trembled. She involuntarily dropped the ribbon. Edward recoiled, hitting his shoulder on the doorframe. He hadn't expected any sound. Not today, not ever, to be honest. The word resonated within him more powerfully than any he had heard in years. His son, his unreachable, inaccessible son, had spoken. Not Mama, Rosa said. No, Papa, no. Yes, Rosa said, not even Mama. Edward's reaction was immediate. He rushed forward, eyes wide, and fell to his knees beside the wheelchair. His heart pounded in his ribs. He wasn't gasping. Say it again. Say Papa. Can you say Papa? He puffed out the child's cheeks.